So here it is. How does a PS5 work? So first, we're going to be looking at the controller, the innovative new PlayStation 5 controller. Well, I guess you wondered of the craze of the PS5, but at least before you're going to buy the PlayStation 5, or at least after 1 year after the scalpers stop buying the PS5, you might want to know, how does the PS5 work and what are the components of it? Well, it's basically a computer, except a cut down version of a computer. So here it is. On the left, we got the D-pad. On the bottom, we got the joysticks. Unlike the Xbox, the D-pad and the left joystick are switch. And like the Xbox, the top two adaptive triggers are adaptive. So that means game devs can basically program to have resistance. For example, let's say you're pulling a bowstring with high resistance. So the controller or the what is it called? The triggers are gonna be tighter to pull to resist. But let's say you're shooting an AK-47 with no suppressor and with lots of recoil. Your adaptive triggers are gonna be shaking. It's gonna be very easy to pull down the trigger, but the recoil is gonna be so much that the adaptive triggers are gonna be wobbling and shaking, as with the Hill controller. On the middle here, we got the microphone and the, iconic PlayStation logo. So yes, what is inside? Inside here is the printed circuit board. It's basically like a mini computer, except it's not a mini computer. Let me explain. So it's called the PCB, or the printed circuit board. On the bottom left, on the bottom right, we've got what they call, or the rumble packs, one for the left and one for the right. They actually have wires connecting to the PCB, but this will be in a later image since I don't want to mess it up. So in the middle, we got a 5.7 watt-hour battery, compared to the DualShock's 3.4 watt-hour battery. But what does this come to battery life? Well, the PlayStation 5 only gets 1 hour more of gameplay. What I mean by that is you can only use the controller 1 more hour versus the PlayStation 4 controller. Well, if you're gonna ask me why, since the battery capacity basically doubled, then why don't the battery life kind of double? Well, the problem is that because of the new adaptive triggers and the sophisticated, more high-tech with more capacity rumble pads and with improved D-pad, it's going to be consuming more battery life. And besides, we got a better microphone, and this time it has to have a more powerful CPU, since they have to be able to compute all this. Since it's giving extra features, and because of the extra features, it needs a more powerful CPU, and this requires better battery life. So this is the microphone. And these are the rumble pads on the top left and the top right are what they call the adaptive triggers. So yes, let's get on to the next slide. So here it is. There's the Realtec audio codec. Basically, what the Realtec audio codec is that basically decodes audio. For example, computers or CPUs store values as zeros or ones. One with a charge and one with no electricity. Basically, one has a positive charge or electricity, and the zero has no electricity. And what this does is that it takes these signals, encodes them or decodes them like a calculator or something. It computes the thing, or computes 1 + 1 = 2, except does a more complicated version, and decompresses it, decodes them, and basically just gives you the output. Or a bunch of ones and zeros can make a different audio line. For example, 1100 can make A or B or C or D, and so on. And on here is the Sony chip. This is basically a mini custom-made CPU, except it's basically the same processor your school Chromebook uses, or basically a 2005 smartphone uses. It's the same chip, except why do they use such a low-power chip? Since all it does is that it doesn't do complicated things like your computer, where it does a billion things, not a billion things, about up to 16 things at once, because it has 16 cores. This only has 4 cores which run at about half a gigahertz, since one for each. One for the adaptive trigger, one core for the right adaptive trigger, one for the rumble pack, and the other one for the other rumble pack. Basically, this is the main GPU. On here is the dialogue management ICU. This basically, as for example, let's say you're playing Fortnite and you're enabled voice chat. Well, what's gonna take basically a computer takes audio in as zeros and ones, like I said. And basically, the dialogue management ICUs compresses them kind of like a zip file. Like how you zip a file and make it smaller. That's basically what it does. It basically makes the audio smaller, so it can travel through the air in your Wi-Fi to the other person or whoever you're talking to while playing Fortnite. And also uncompresses audio. For example, let's say they're talking. So what this does, and at the same time, it also decompresses it, since the part on the left compresses the audio, so it can be sent to the other player. The thing on the right decompresses it, so you could hear it. It basically is transferred into zeros and ones. As you can see, here are the adaptive triggers. The farther in it goes, the more resistance there is. And this will only work if game devs take advantage of this, which they most likely will. Also, the Xbox doesn't have this. It still uses the old Xbox One controller from 2013. So yeah, boo. Okay, so here is the whole thing. So here is what we call the joystick. So if we take out the joysticks, this is what we have. Basically, what this does is that it takes the coordinates of where the joystick has been moved, sends it to this thing, this mini CPU, and then it transfers it to the PlayStation 5, and then sends it to the other person or with the game, or the server where the game is being held at. So what basically does, that's basically what it does. And also, this can be adaptive, but that, like I said, game devs have to be taking advantage of this. And here we have a mini speaker. Why do we have a mini speaker? Well, I'm pretty sure it's used to just, I don't know, maybe you could hear the other person, maybe if you're not wearing headphones, but like for example, this is kind of like a sound effects. Like if there was a shooting sound effect, or like a sound effect which is not very loud but also kind of quiet, this will do it. For example, let's say a character is talking. This speaker will get activated, but if it's a shooting sound, this speaker won't do it, since it will be too loud and the speaker will basically just, explode, not explode, it will just die, since this is the capacity of the speaker isn't very high, and it'll only do like small things, like, NPCs talking, whatever. So basically all it does is talking. So here's the PCB itself. And yes, now we're going to talk about the disk. Or well, once you put your disk in, well, it's a disk, so how does it work? So here we have the disk, or it takes in the disk. So basically these two arms hook the disk, so it takes it in, so you don't have to push it in. And these motors just help it go in. And unlike an old-fashioned disk player, this uses new technology. Since in the bottom, there's actually a space. That's why we have a laser here, to take that print and spit it back out. Basically, it just reads the disk. So that's why it doesn't have to touch the bottom, unlike these. these old also it's the same as PlayStation 3. It doesn't have to touch the bottom. So like I said, it just reads the thing. That's why this new high-tech technology, which is already had been in the PlayStation 4, it just uses lasers, so it doesn't have to touch the back. So that's why it doesn't really touch or scratch the disc itself. So that's why you don't have to be scared. Or in the PlayStation 3 days, you don't have to wipe your disc and pray to God to make it work. So yeah, nowadays buying used games isn't that bad, since the CD has a 99% chance of working. Unlike the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 2 days, where it was a 50-50 chance if the CD was gonna work or not. So yeah. So here it is, the board itself. PlayStation 5 board itself. Here's the fan, and in the fan is the fan. Why is the fan here? Well, this is a very smart design by Sony. Instead of putting it here, they put a whole heatsink here in order to distribute it here. And also, another thing is that this fan can also cool the whole board itself. That way, it's not only this. That way, they don't have to add two fans. They can just get it by with just one fan. And I have to also. That's why the PlayStation 5 is louder than the Xbox. Since the Xbox has two fans, this only has one fan. And well, it's another smart design and also a risky design was liquid metal. Liquid metal is a liquid which it's basically like water. If you poke a hole through it or something happens, like let's say you drop it and the enclosure breaks, the PlayStation 5 is ruined. Unlike an Xbox, it doesn't use liquid metal. So even if you drop it, just 90% chance that's not gonna happen. Unlike Plane Rock 1, 2, 3, 4 comes to your house and breaks everything, that's not going to happen. So you probably don't have to be worried about that. If you're one of those old people, or let's say you're at your grandparents' house and they don't have Wi-Fi, there's an Ethernet chip here. Basically, that is one of those old-fashioned cable Wi-Fi. And here is the latest high-tech. It's not really latest. It was already invented in 1999. It's Wi-Fi. The Wi-Fi chip. It decodes your Wi-Fi signals and everything, your router history and everything like that. Why is there a Wi-Fi chip? Well, let's say you're downloading something illegally on your PlayStation. This will prevent that. So that's why it has a Wi-Fi chip. And it only comes with consoles, since they don't want you to download games online or download Windows on your PlayStation or something like that. So here we have VRAM. One of these modules are 2 gigabytes. So it comes total with 8 modules. 8 times 2 is 16. And it has 16 gigs of GDDR6 memory. And they call it VRAM. Why? It's not called RAM. Well, VRAM is RAM only dedicated for the GPU. It's the graphics processing unit. What the graphics processing unit does, it's basically a CPU, except it's not a CPU. While your CPU is mainly focused on how many frames, the GPU, actually does, or the graphics. It's basically the graphics. And the CPU is the frames. But let's say you're playing at 4K. Most of the frames are going to be dependent on your GPU, because you're playing at 4K resolution, the frames are probably going to be halved. Or if you don't have enough VRAM, like I said, it's going to be 30 FPS, unlike 60 FPS in the PlayStation 5. Since your CPU is not going to be doing that much work, since it's 4K resolution, and since it only needs to produce 30 frames, it doesn't really need to do that much work. While the GPU is the one that's going to be doing most of the work, since it needs to produce graphics at 4K resolution versus 1080p, where CPU is doing most of the work. Since the GPU can easily get by with a fourth of the graphics, while the CPU has to do 2 times more of the work, since it needs to play games or render frames at 60 FPS, or in some cases, even 120 FPS. But that's probably when you're going to be playing at 1440p. or upscaled 4K, like Call of Duty. And finally, and last, we got this, the heatsink. So this PlayStation 5 has 36 CUs running at 2.23 gigahertz with an 8-core Zen 2 CPU clocked at 3.5 gigahertz versus the Xbox with 56 CUs running at 1.82 gigahertz and 8-core CPU running at a nominal 3.8 gigahertz. Well, if you're going to ask me, which is going to be faster? Which is going to be getting more frames? Well, actually, since game devs optimize more for PlayStation 5, since 75% of console gamers buy the PlayStation 5, they're going to optimize the PlayStation 5 more. And basically, the PlayStation 5 is going to get more FPS, while the Xbox is going to be getting more FPS at 4K resolutions and maybe even 1080p resolution with RTX on. So basically, if you're a high FPS gamer, you should get the PlayStation 5. Or if you just want good graphics, you should get the Xbox Series X. But in the long term, the Xbox is going to win. For example, let's say you're going to keep your PlayStation 5 for 5 years. And as like any computer component, it's going to age. And the clocks are going to go slowly down. The CPU clocks are going to go slowly down since your liquid metal is going to go away. It's going to evaporate. Well, not really evaporate. It's just going to conduct away since it's just going to go away. So the CPU clocks will go slowly down. The GPU clocks will go down. But since it'll slowly go down to about 2 gigahertz, and this will go to 3.2. And at that point, it's going to be about 10-20% slower than your Xbox FPS. So let's say you're going to quit, and in the next 4 years you're going to upgrade to the PlayStation 5 Pro. You should probably just get the PlayStation 5, and since you're going to upgrade to the PlayStation 5 Pro, you sell this. If you're going to be a long-term gamer, you're going to have it for 7 whole years. Until the next PlayStation 6 releases, you should just get the Xbox, since in the long term, this is going to be more stable and a lot less noisier, since this only has 2 fans. And 2 fans. Since it only has 2 fans, it only has to spin about half the RPM of the PlayStation 5. That's why the PlayStation 5 is louder than the Xbox Series X. So that's it. I am done with your PlayStation 5 crash course.